Our Communications Minister Paul Fletcher has said that he's going to consider looking at legislation, rules around the streaming services to try and ensure that there's Australian content placed upon Netflix and Amazon and Stan and whatever others. Last week we heard, I think it was Channel 7 in particular, was saying, look, we can't really afford to keep making Australian children's content, for example, that we've got requirements to do that, and where profits are failing, it's not a lucrative area. We need to stop that. And the commercial producers, the commercial TV outlets who have the rules around Australian content have pretty much always complained about it and always tried to bring it down. I should point out, I suppose, I think the ABC doesn't have the same requirements as the commercial ones, but it's a regular thing to try and push those boundaries. What exactly would it mean if we were to have rules around the streaming services? How might that work? How much of this is a problem for local production? Matthew Diener is the CEO of Screen Producers Australia, and he joins us this afternoon. Matthew, g'day.
G'day, James. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks for coming on. How difficult are things at the moment? Let's look at perhaps the existing situation. What are your concerns about free to air and Australian content?
Well, it's a complicated area, so we sort of have to break it down a bit. First up, there's an overarching set of problems in that the government's had this on their to-do list since about 2012 when the Convergence Review happened, and it put forward a whole heap of recommendations essentially along the lines of, regulating the new streaming platforms. And if that had been put into action, about 8 years ago, we wouldn't probably be at this point where the tensions are escalating even further across the industry. With regards to the sort of overall challenge for producers is what you're trying to do when you're making content is have a marketplace. You want lots of people who are interested in purchasing your content because that way you've got the competition of ideas and there's lots of different avenues for you to go to. And at the moment, as you correctly summarised, the obligations sit on the 7, 9 and 10 networks to be producing certain types of content. And there actually technically aren't specific regulations on the ABC or SBS, and there's nothing on the new entrants in the market. So from a producer's layer, what you're trying to do is you're not saying don't change anything, you're sort of going, well, let's try to bring new people into the system and let's adapt a system so that it better suits the modern environment, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater either.
Does it have to adapt to the changing free-to-air situation, the commercial free-to-air situation, which is there's not the money there that there once was?
Well, yes, that is absolutely there in terms of the overarching trend for the free-to-air broadcasters. Their dollars are down, no doubt about it. What's the challenge at the moment is that children's content isn't really the answer to that structural problem. It's 0.5% of their overall investment in content, so it's such a very small amount. And what it does is it probably doesn't get the same, it doesn't get big audiences on its first release. It does get a cumulative audience across lots and lots and lots of airings, and which is the way children watch a lot of content. And increasingly, we know that children are watching online. So it's sort of in our purview that they really should be moving a whole regulatory model to, the 7 catch-ups, sort of 10 catch-ups, 9 businesses that are more online. And we've seen that work really well for someone like ABC, which of course has launched and had a very successful run at developing a children's brand through 5U and other services online and an app. So they're the kind of markets where you go, that's where it all should be pointing towards so that there's an ongoing demand. But you probably need to relax a few things, but you don't want to let them completely out of the picture because then that removes the kind of local commercial businesses who are, in the market. And I think when we're noticing is that we should be getting those international streaming services on board, and we can talk about that, of course, but having local businesses that commission and broadcast content, working with the creative industry on a hand-to-hand, day-to-day basis is really critical for the health of the sector.
We're talking to Matthew Diener, CEO of Screen Producers Australia, and talking about potential changes to legislation around Australian content, Australian-produced content on the streaming services and our TV screens. The streaming services, let's focus on that. The streaming services, to me, it seems like something where I can sense the desire. I have no idea how you do it. The difference between, a Channel 7 or a 9 is it's finite in its output, in a sense. You can say if you've got 100 hours, we want 10 of them to be Australia. How do you say that to Netflix or Stan?
Yeah, and it's an interesting little quandary that people have been working through in terms of how to regulate now, and we are certainly keeping an eye on what's happening globally. And where they've moved in Europe around this is to say that what you want in their mind is a percentage of their overall library, if you like, because it's really a big catalogue they have. A percentage of library that should be local. In their case, they say European. They also say there's a percentage of money that they should be reinvesting in the local market based on the revenues that they receive. And that's very similar in some ways to the model that Foxtel has, where they have to do an expenditure payment into local drama. So that's a system that works. The third thing they do in Europe is they say that those broadcast, or those streaming services rather, should have a obligation to promote the content, so that in that midst of 1,000,001 choices, if people were looking for local, Australian content in our case, then they should be able to find it easily. Maybe there's a tab, an easy way to access it, a search function, so that it doesn't get buried in amongst 1,000,001 maybe deals and behind the scenes that push at the top of the viewing page an algorithm that only shows you the latest Marvel comic strip sort of movies.
Yeah.
So that's the way they've approached it. And I think that there's merit in us absolutely going down those paths, particularly the expenditure obligation, because it's a really critical thing that I think when you spend money, you also care about what that money looks like on screen. And critically, it should be Australian, because I think what everyone's, furious agreement about is that there is a need for Australian stories, there's a need for Australian voices. I think there's lots of arguments about really who should be carrying the can and at what level. So, if you can kind of get everyone agreeing ultimately to some principles around that, then I think we're good.
But again, I'm just sort of thinking in practical terms, Netflix doesn't even tell you how many people watched a show. Like,
no.
How are you going to know that they should be putting $10 million, $500 million back into the Australian market?
Well, Netflix does pay GST, and that allows you to calculate basically the 10% that's paid from GST through the tax system, basically the dollars that they receive, and from that you can deduce a calculation based on the rough number of people if they're not absolutely required to deliver that information. So the dollars invested in the market is calculable through the tax regime. But I'd also think that what we're heading towards, I think, is that every service, whether in fact it might be based in Los Angeles or Ireland or whatever, but if it's basically providing a service in Australia at a certain scale, is probably needing to be captured under a licence of sorts, and that would be something that the ACMA can control the degree of which businesses that are transmitting illegal materials are sort of stopped. And
so like a broad equivalent of a broadcast licence, which costs $20 million a year or something, and that just goes straight into Australian production, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's a way of providing a framework that then means that they're properly captured by classification and certain, obligations. And I don't think you do that for everyone. I think the Convergence Review back in 2012 suggested that, at a certain threshold, say 500,000 subscribers or this amount of revenue, then you have a set of obligations because you're at a scale that, is contributing sensibly. And I think that when you get to that level of brand awareness in the market, you also have a brand reputation. So there's certainly, Netflix never comes out and says they hate Australian content, but I think there's an easier obligation or conversation really with government to be had at that point to say, well, come on, you're at this point, you're draining from a system a bit as well, because we help sort of pay certain amounts into your lens through tax support, so we should be also asking...
Should be getting something back. The other view would be to say something like a Netflix or a Prime or Amazon Prime gives every opportunity to every producer around the world to be global. They want content, they're starving for it, they're like a beast, they're just sucking stuff up as soon as they can get it. Why isn't this just rampant opportunity for every filmmaker in the country?
Well, as it is, so there's a real positive around those services being existing and providing a platform that's global. And certainly we've had some examples where our productions are doing very well and are being commissioned on those services. I think the ongoing challenge, though, is that we are an English-speaking territory a long way away from other markets, and it is not that difficult to imagine a scenario by which a global service is reallocating resources into other pockets, perhaps that are closer, based on maybe other incentives or other things, and also at a time perhaps in the future when there is less pressure on them in a regulatory sense to be contributing. So you can imagine a world where you need a baseline of investment, and specifically if territories, as they are in Europe and Canada, are regulating to ensure that there are going to be ongoing commitments for local content. We're sort of nuts as a sector here if we don't have the same, or at least the same sort of system, because otherwise, of course, Netflix is going to have to prioritise its expenditure in territories in Europe and Canada and not ignore us, I suppose. Yeah. So, it's not exactly a level playing field if we don't also step up to do this.
Matthew, thanks for outlining some of that for us.
You're very welcome, James.
Good to talk to you, Matthew Diener, CEO of Screen Producers Australia.